it has now come to our final panel, which is around payments. So before we do the payments panel, I have to pay my thanks. Did you catch that? To a number of people in the room. We've said thank you to Craig. We will continue to say thank you to Craig, but events like this don't just come together overnight. They are months and months of work. We began the day by thanking Venable and the Coalition for Cybersecurity Policy and Law, Ari and Bree, who's continuing to work on today's events. But I really want to thank the team at IST. Obviously, thanks to Phil for giving me lots of room to maneuver, maybe against his better judgment sometimes, but here we are. But really, I want to say thanks to Sophia, who's been sitting here, and Lillian on our comms team, who have been instrumental in making all of this look great. Emma and Trey, who's trying to run away from me, for all of their great work and putting together a dinner that we had last night with Paladin Capital. Thanks again, Kemba and team, for working on that with us. And last but not least, there she is. She just came back. I want to thank Taylor Grossman, one of the newest members of our team, who is one of the principal author behind the report that we published today. So we threw Taylor into the deep end, and I would say she came out more than swimmingly. So thank you, and much appreciated. Okay, who did I forget? I don't think I forgot anyone. Of course, the co-chairs and Steve. So, okay, without further ado, but sincere thanks to the IST team. We can't be here without all of you. It's over to my last and final co-chair, friend, and colleague, Michael Phillips from CFC, to moderate this panel.
Thank you, Mike. All right, is everybody fired up? This is what you've all been waiting for. I know, a panel focused on how the cyber insurance market works. I promise you it's a fascinating area. I do have, okay, great, all of my panelists with me. My name is Michael Phillips. I lead the cyber insurance underwriting department for the United States for a firm called CFC. We're pretty much the largest part of Lloyd's of London for cyber insurance. And with me, I've got a set of wonderful panelists who you might as well come up and pick a seat as you like. So I served as co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force, continue to do so. During the original sprint, I partnered with Kemba Walden on many of the Disrupt working groups and initiatives, and a couple of the subsidiary initiatives that we took on and that IST has driven forward, focused on the insurance industry and how it can be a better partner in the fight against ransomware, and the cryptocurrency industry, and how it could be a better partner in the fight against ransomware. So payments, of course, has been a thread throughout all of our conversations today. And so I'm hoping that this will be a very interactive, very lively audience interrupting us throughout to really bookend the conversations around Disrupt that we heard with Kemba Walden's panel, the challenge we heard from Chris Krebs about developing a framework, and so many of our experts today talking about that decision and how we can influence that decision to ultimately decrease criminal profits. So I am going to join them, but I'm enjoying this podium, so I'm gonna stay up here just a little longer. So with me are wonderful panelists, and to my left, I'd like to introduce them. So Sezaneh Seymour is the Vice President and Head of Regulatory Risk and Policy at Coalition, another one of the market-leading cyber insurance companies. She's an accomplished advisor to the US government as well, in the US Trade Representative's Office, and as a senior advisor in the National Security Council, and in the Treasury and State Departments. To her left is Carolyn Purwin Ryan, a partner at Mullen Coughlin, one of the perhaps the largest law firm in the United States, devoted exclusively to cybersecurity and data privacy events. All they do all day long is counsel small businesses right of boom, both insured clients, where they have an enviable market position, if I may say, and uninsured clients as well. To her left is Jamie MacColl from the Royal United Services Institute. And for those of you who might not be familiar with RUSI, it is the UK's foremost national security research institution. Jamie is a research fellow focused on cyber there. They've recently put out a series of exceptional reports, and he's the principal author of them, devoted to the ransomware challenge and also studying the cyber insurance market and whether it is succeeding or failing on both its own terms and on social purpose. To Jamie's left is Gwenn Cujdik. She leads the North American Incident Response Team for AXA XL. Again, one of the largest insurance companies in the world, and her team in Canada and the United States, focuses exclusively on coaching their clients through those crises. She's long been a victims advocate as a prosecutor in Philadelphia and as a data privacy lawyer. And to her left, last but not least, our special representative from the crypto space is Jason Somensatto, the head of North American public policy for Chainalysis, the blockchain investigations firm. And so I am going to join my group and turn on the other mic and see what happens. But the conversation that we're hoping to have at scale is around three threads. The first being our perspective on the victim's experience. I know something that folks have talked about throughout the day, and that the insurance market has a unique perspective on, given that we are seeing victims each day, day in and day out. And so I think I'm going to kick it to Carolyn first to talk through what you see are the most common factors that compel an organization to decide to pay a ransom, and whether SMEs and large corporates are different.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, can everybody hear me okay? Oh my goodness, it really is. I feel like it is. Look at me singing into a microphone. Well, anyway, everybody, I really appreciate everybody's time. So really want to walk through, I kind of look at it, I also come from a litigation background, like Gwenn over there. So I look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So when companies are trying to make these decisions, a lot of the times, some of the times you don't have a choice, right? So you got to pay, you don't have backups, you got to go, all right, fine. That's decision box A. But then what are we talking about in terms of everything else? A lot of the times you're talking about, okay, monetary. I know one of the other panelists, they were talking about business interruption costs. It's probably one of the single largest things that I'm seeing right now is business interruption, what it's like to be down. I mean, we're seeing statistics all over the place, but on average, companies can be down a month. Well, can we talk about what it would cost each and every company out there to be down for a month, right? Then you weigh that against, should I pay this threat actor, right? So that's what some of the companies are looking at. And then the other piece to it is reputational harm. I will say this, I know Lizzie's probably going to be nodding her head from Cobra over there. A lot of the times I'm seeing a very big increase in this reputational harm. But I want to be careful with separating out. One of the biggest issues that I'm hearing is there's a difference between ransomware and full-blown extortion, right? We are seeing, thank you. Oh, all right. Oh my goodness, now I'm going to be even louder. So we actually we keep a lot of internal statistics. We probably have about 4,000 of these matters that we have per year that we handle. We went from having about a 30%, because we keep statistics as to why people pay. The biggest increase that we saw was for deletion only. And a lot of that has to do with the business interruption costs, but the other piece is that reputational harm. This is the most, in the past 6 months, this is the biggest increase in aggressive activity that I've ever seen. Some of the other panelists from the other companies that were up there were certainly talking about this. From my own personal experience, I had a CISO on, a couple of weeks ago call me because they got sent a flower arrangement while we were in the midst of a ransomware negotiations to their home, right? Led to a very quick ransomware payment. The other one, it was a social media post that they had received. It was the CEO's niece, where it had her location services. And I had a very frank conversation with the CEO, and I got asked that $1 million question. Can you guarantee me that these people are not going to come to my home, or not going to come to the home of my niece? And you know what? Now that we have the worlds of Scattered Spider and other ones where we have cells in the US, I can't guarantee that, right? Most likely not, but I can't guarantee. And I know other of the panelists who are up here are probably going to say the same thing.
Gwenn, in the sort of the crucible of the incident response room, when you've got all the stakeholders in there, how do the different stakeholders influence the decision about whether or not to pay? So perhaps internal IT and the finance department, the external law firm and the forensic firm, the insurer. How would you speak to the stakeholders and how they're shaping the conversation in that room?
So I always like to get in front of our insureds ahead of an event. I think, helping them understand what lies out there before they actually have the incident can be very helpful. Some of the things that I always tell our insureds is do not just have your CISO on the call with me. I want your legal counsel on, I want your CFO on, your CEO. If you'd like, we can do a webinar. We can talk about why everybody is critical into the decisions to pay a ransom or what happens in any investigation or response. And they're kind of blown away by that. They're like, why do I need to get the CEO in here? I was like, well, who's gonna give the authority to pay $10 million at 24 hours after you got hit? And then they're like, oh, okay. And I was like, it's not going to be you and your guys sitting in the computer room making that decision. And so it's really important to have the entire company involved in that decision. But also when we're talking about ransom payment, especially after OFAC, is that we're all a party to that ransom payment. As an insurance company, we're highly regulated in the financial industry. We want to get it right. And so we want to make sure that if a ransom payment is made, that everybody has done their due diligence and that we're paying on a legal basis and a compliant basis. So it's really important from our perspective to make sure that everybody involved is doing the right thing. So it's not just the insurance company, it's not just the company that is experiencing the event. There's also the experts that we try to bring in to empower our companies to make good decisions about whether or not they want to pay a ransom. That's people like breach coaches, Carolyn's firm. It's like Mandiant, for example. Sandra was up here talking about all the intelligence they have on threat actors. We mentioned Lizzie in the back there with Coveware. When we're deciding on whether or not a ransom should be paid, and that's not us, it's solely our insured's decision on whether or not they want to pay a ransom. But we're providing information. We're saying, hey, listen, last week we had the same threat actor and this is what we saw. This is what they did. These are things to help you make a better informed decision on whether or not you want to pay that ransom. Supplementing that with what Coveware's saying, supplementing that with what 4,000 events that Caroline's team is seeing, and supplementing that with the investigative team. All of that empowers the company to make a decision on whether or not they want to pay a ransom. And one thing that we do that I think is really, really important, and I always try to give this ahead of an event, is we have a questionnaire that we give to our insureds about it's a decision tree, so to speak, on whether or not it's reasonable and necessary to make a payment. And it has things that these companies have no idea that they should be asking each other. What is the risk on third party at the end? Is there a class action suit? Is there regulatory issues that you're considering when it's a data exfiltration event? What is the BI cost? And, that's huge. Sometimes I'll ask, we're seeing terabytes go out the door now. Do you know how much it costs to just data mine that? It can be tens of millions of dollars to get through terabytes just to figure out what's in that. And so if you're paying $4 million, you're going to be out of money pretty quick if you're paying a ransom and you aren't thinking about all the costs that are associated with it. So it is a collaborative effort, but at the end of the day, I can't stress enough that it's the business that makes that decision on whether or not it's best for their company. And we can only empower them to make the right decisions collaboratively.
Sezaneh, Gwenn mentioned sanctions component, and I'd be curious what you're experiencing or what Coalition's experiencing with respect to whether the sanctions regime is influencing a victim's maybe marginal decision to pay.
Thank you. Let me if I could just back up a moment, because I think there are so many steps that happen before we even get to a place of payment. And hopefully, if we're doing things right, we never get there, right? We try to look at different alternatives. So if I could just take a step back and talk about how the insurance landscape is changing quite a bit in response to the rise in frequency of digital crime, to include ransomware, but not only ransomware. And it's changing in a couple of ways that are important to, I think, policymakers in the room. The first is with respect to how we measure and mitigate risk with our policyholders. Insurance companies more and more are now using technology to actually accurately assess the risk of a policyholder at bind. So when they come to us, we measure their risk and we provide them some information about how they could or should improve in order to get a policy. And then we use technology to continue to monitor them throughout the life of the policy. And I'll give you a concrete example, because I think this is important I know this is a payments panel, but I
Yeah,
think
please.
the insurance sector does so much more that I think gets lost in the conversation. Here's a concrete example of what happened last year. Everyone remembers the Citrix bleed vulnerability. That last October, Citrix came out, announced Citrix bleed, released a patch. That same day, we looked at our book of business. We went out to all of our affected policyholders, alerted them to the patch. And in some cases, we have some smaller companies, we actually help them mitigate their, actually mitigate their vulnerability and install that patch. So what that means, bring it back to the policy discussion that we have here today, is that for some non-zero subset of policyholders, they were never forced to make the decision about whether to pay. They never had to ask, is this a sanctioned or OFAC sanctioned entity? And that's, I think, important. And it's something that we need to remember. And it gets to some points that you're making. The second place, which I think is related to your question, is in the incident response place. That's where the industry has had to evolve. And to Gwen's point, one of the early things that we do is we make sure that any of our policyholders actually has a plan in place for a breach, right? Do you have backups offline? Do you know how to exercise them? Who makes what decisions? And at the time of a breach, of course, we immediately get our insureds, their like a team essentially around them. So we hire a breach coach. We typically have a digital forensics and incident response team that looks at things like when you get to a payment decision, if you get there, what are your alternatives to payment to get to the 24 and 24? Two of the unactioned items are actually things that insurance companies are actively doing. Like, what are your alternatives? Have you considered the secondary and tertiary costs of paying? So that's a very routine set of questions to the point you guys have raised in the insurance landscape. And there, of course, like when you're making a payment, we and breach counsel and everyone that advises an insured, like, if there's a sanctioned entity, there's no payment on the table. So it will affect, absolutely, we've never, I was on another panel where someone suggested that businesses just want to pay and move on, but that's not really been our experience.
Thank you, Sezaneh. Yeah,
At
Carolyn?
least just to make one comment on that, at least to my understanding, and please, anybody in this room, correct me if I'm wrong. To date, there has not been sanctions issued for any ransomware payment, but I certainly don't want my client to be the first, right? That's one reason why we don't want to be having that, at least for any sort of ransomware payment. But I think it's also becomes this big conversation now that we're having, which is if it doesn't negate your obligation to notify those individuals if you do make a payment, right? So that's what is the incentive to pay? What are you actually paying for? It's a handshake agreement, right? It's not like you could go to court and say, you know what, they didn't abide by what they're worth. They didn't, now we're seeing they sell to their buddy down the street, right? They're not, I mean, now there's so many entities. Now we see that they're actually keeping the data. So what are we actually paying for? But the problem is now you have entities that are out there that are seeing these massive class action lawsuits, right? So now what do you do about it, right? So now what I would love to see is, does it negate, if you make a payment, does that mean that you don't have a class action lawsuit against you? No, right? That's not what we're seeing, right? So, but unfortunately, people have come back to me and say, I need to be able to look in the eyes of my customers, the vendors that I work with, the DoD contracts that I have, and be able to say, I did everything in my power to negate that, to make sure it doesn't get on the doorstep.
So Jamie, RUSI put out a report trying to map the full spectrum of harms to ransomware, and obviously we've had a big day today talking about the harms of ransomware. But what additional harms are underappreciated, do you think, in the public policy debate?
I think the big one, the financial and reputational aspect of it is pretty obvious to everyone in this room, and I think they can get their head around that. I spent a couple of years interviewing ransomware victims in the UK and Europe, and I think the thing that stood out to me most was the psychological aspect of it. I think, as someone said earlier, for many people, particularly for small businesses, a ransomware event can be the worst day, not just in their professional lives, but in their personal lives as well. I've spoken to people that were, two people businesses, they'd built it from scratch. It was all they'd ever known, and there was the prospect of that being taken away from them. And there were people that were suicidal, having heart attacks, kind of complete breakdowns. And I think it is very easy, particularly in the kind of broader policy debates and when we're talking about things like payment bans, to forget the kind of very human aspect of it.
Now, trying to debate which question next. I think I want to come back to Gwenn. You were talking about AXA offering a questionnaire to sort of frame the client's thinking when they're going through a ransomware event. How common is that, do you think, in the cyber insurance space? And is it true that you're not really weighing in on the decision? You know, so if the client said, look, I'm not going to pay because I've got a moral or, you know, a national security sense that this would exacerbate the problem, but I know I'm going to be submitting a much larger claim down the road about my business interruption loss or my liability. Are you really standing there and saying, yep, we'll take that hit for you? Yeah, could you talk about that?
Okay, there we go. So I think a good thing is to take a step back and just say that, you know, while we see hundreds, maybe thousands of events, there is a strong urge not to pay ransom. I think education has worked. People don't want to pay, but they are forced into situations where they have no choice but to pay. You know, we are there. We don't throw our hands up. We don't say, you know, just go your own way. You know, we have a questionnaire that helps them walk through that process, like I said, and that is pretty standard amongst the industry. I've been on towers, which is all the insurance companies when a really big event hits. And every single company is saying, are you discussing whether or not this is reasonable and necessary under the circumstances? What is specific about this event? I've had some people say, well, this is a mega breach and this is approximately how much it is, you know, for similar breaches. And I'm like, I don't care. What is this breach? What does this mean? What does it mean to you and this company under this facts and circumstances? And that really is the deciding factor on whether or not somebody's going to pay. You know, a lot of times people say, I don't want to pay, I don't want to pay. But then you get into the data and it's like, oh my God, they have photos of cancer patients. Like that is going to get out there. Can we put a price on that? If we don't pay, 911's down. If we don't pay, we don't get access to the evidence server for our police department, which means that maybe we can't prosecute murders. So it's like, what's happening at this moment? And I think that's really, really important. And companies like AXA XL, you know, our job and our goal is to make sure that you have all the information you need to decide whether or not, and I don't want to say most often it's a last resort. Most often it's that we don't have another choice. We can't get up and running. The data is so sensitive that it's a security risk, or there is risk to, you know, the health, safety, and welfare of human beings. Or in large enterprise, which is what we see a lot at AXA XL, is, you know, if this large company goes down, what other companies go down with it? With Change Healthcare, I think that we're seeing it's $1 billion, but a lot of that is what we call dependent business interruption, meaning they all rely on Change Healthcare and everybody's down because of it. And so, you know, when Change Healthcare is thinking about whether or not they want to pay a ransom, it's not just Change Healthcare, it's everybody they service. And it can be a real issue of health, safety, and welfare that you can't put a dollar value on.
Jason, I've been neglecting you. I'm curious where in the Chainalysis is typically engaged. So are victims directly calling you saying, look, we'd love to engage your technology and your services because we think we're about to pay and we need to make decisions? Is it typically a financial intermediary like an insurance company or a bank that's engaging you guys? How does that work from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it comes across our desk in a few different ways. At a kind of specific incident level, yes, there are companies that support this space and that are, you know, involved in incident response and insurance that will utilize our tools, which for people who don't know, essentially attribute specific cryptocurrency wallet addresses to certain actors and help trace where those funds go after the fact. You know, because there's clearly a due diligence element that companies are going through, and one of the things that we build into is that compliance infrastructure. I will say is, like, from where I sit, probably the more important role we play is in conjunction with the government, right? So a lot of the investigation staff within various agencies utilize our tools or competitors' tools, and are, in the position of trying to think what happens after this payment is made. How do we step in here? What intelligence can we gather based on the movement of funds? And so I think particularly ransomware is a interesting use of kind of the crypto rails and the compliance infrastructure that's been built up around it, because a traditional payment, let's say that somebody stole from somebody else, right? The exchange that ultimately receives that payment would love to be able to flag that and say, hey, we're gonna, freeze these funds and not let this person cash this out. But in a ransom situation, that's usually going to end up coming back on the victim if there is a intervention at that point in time, right? And so you really do need to be thinking strategically about, where do funds get pooled together? When is the time to kind of step in if we have that availability? And some of what are the challenges, right? Where are people going to offload these funds and whatnot? I guess I'll just add one last point, which is all those responses dealt very much with specific incidents that people are dealing with. I think at a policy level, there's a harder question to kind of grapple with, which is the reason probably a lot of the growth in there's been a lot of growth in this sector over the past few years is because cryptocurrency is a particularly weak area of our financial infrastructure from a compliance perspective that these criminals can leverage. And so I know in the Ransomware Task Force reports, there's been a lot of focus on the need to improve that kind of global compliance infrastructure so that this isn't such a tool that can be exploited. And kind of trying to balance so I'm a former financial regulator. I spend most of my time thinking about financial regulatory policy and spent the last 10 years only thinking about how to deal with it in the crypto ecosystem. So I come at this this has been a fascinating environment for me to learn from everybody about cybersecurity policy, which is not where I spend most of my time. But when I think about the need to improve the kind of regulation environment around crypto so that it does not become a tool for this type of activity, becomes this kind of two boats crossing of how do we get to the point where that's so secure that it is a disincentive for these actors while also not abusing the victims who are being kind of taken advantage of in this environment.
That's interesting. Yeah, please, Gwenn.
Earlier, we talked about safe harbors being geographical locations. And honestly, after, listening to you and, thinking about it all the time, cryptocurrency really is a safe harbor for these criminals. They can hide behind it. And because they can hide behind it, because we lack regulation and compliance with cryptocurrency, they're going to continue to be able to hide behind it. And, I'm a big proponent of going after the bad guys. That always have been. And so if we can leverage everything to get these bad guys, let's do it.
Jamie, the Change Healthcare event has come up a couple of times, and I'm wondering what you think we might be able to learn about the victim's experience when we analogize or compare and contrast the Change Healthcare event to the Irish National Healthcare System event. Any immediate thoughts?
Well, I think looking at the UK and Ireland, and say looking at the WannaCry attack against our National Health Service in 2017, or the Conti attack against the Irish Healthcare System in 2021, I think there is a difference when you see that in our cases, the decision around things like ransom payments were taken out of the hands of a private company and decided by the state. And those organizations also had the full weight of national governments behind them to respond, recover, and go after the bad guys as well. And I'm just a socialist European here. I think it's to be frank, it's easier to protect nationalized critical national infrastructure than it is privatized national infrastructure, where the incentives are very different.
Sezaneh, the Change Healthcare event, what's the lesson learned that you're seeing? Is it the vendor breach scenario? Is it the systemic risk? the critical infrastructure piece?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, right? I think the reality is we've had a really robust set of discussions today. And what I think that reminds us is once we get to the point where there's a breach and a payment decision has to be made, a lot of things have gone wrong, right? So you're exposed through your third-party vendors, you are buying insecure technology, maybe you're not actually taking the steps that you need to implement basic cyber hygiene. And I think the lesson is we have a lot to do on all fronts. We should pursue them all simultaneously. I think the policy in public policy discussions, we tend to be, at least in the United States, myopically focused on the things that we may have legal and regulatory authorities to at our disposal now. And I think that the lesson is we need to be doing more and maybe looking beyond what we can do now.
It's interesting because I feel like that, a lot of the other panelists were talking about, the fines and the penalization. And I had a laugh because that is one of our clients. It's everybody's, right? That how are we going to incentivize to increase this awareness, right? And right now, I know a lot of companies, especially publicly traded companies, are very upset what's going on with the SEC and the complaint and everything else that's going on right now. So I guess from a payment perspective, I don't want to re-victimize people. And I think that's a big part of the discussion right now, because I know a lot of companies who come and say, well, I get that fine, where does that money go? Right? And I get, if I get that fine, does it go back into a pot of money that's going to help a security policy? No, it does not. Right? So why don't we start that discussion? I know that's kind of like where a lot of companies want that, but then how do you start that process, I guess would be kind of my question, at least from a lot of people's perspectives.
I mean, I think given we're talking about payments, I do think reporting short of a ban is one of the most powerful levers we have to decrease the willingness of victims to pay ransoms, because it shines a light on it, which people are not comfortable with.
Yeah. I mean, my thing, at least with the ban, I was just taking a look at, the statistics on what happened with Florida, what happened with North Carolina that's now banned ransomware payments and discussions with ransomware threat actors. Has it deterred? No, it hasn't. So then it becomes there. I'm sure, Sezaneh, you probably have seen that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think state bans haven't really worked. Just the point on reporting, I do think that's useful, because one of the things that it does is it drives a thoughtful consideration in the process following a breach about what happened, what are the alternatives, what information needs to be reported. What I would say, as we have the notice public rulemaking out there, one of the things that we hear from victims constantly is like, what is the information going to be used for? And at least with CERCIA, like how will the information be collected? Will it be available to others to use so that we can make ourselves safer? But I agree that reporting does move the needle.
Gwenn?
And I would say too, that was a really ingenious policymaking or guidance on behalf of OFAC, was to come out and say that it would be a mitigating factor to report to law enforcement and to work with law enforcement. I think that is huge when people are talking about payments. And actually, with almost all carriers at this point, if you are contemplating paying a ransom payment, we want to see that IC3 report. Or if you're telling me that you're going to give the white glove service and call your contact at the FBI, I want to know what agent you talked to, what field office, what time, what phone number, and what was the summary of that discussion, so that we are very firmly rooted in the idea that we all know that you reported to law enforcement.
I at least think from an information sharing standpoint, I know a lot of the clients that we speak to ask that very same question that Sezaneh was just talking about, which is, where is it going to get me, and what is this information? What are they going to be doing with this information? A lot of the times I'll point them to all the different takedowns. And by the way, in the past, my goodness, year, they've had the FBI and all the collaborating, and some of the agencies that are in this room have been able to get keys to take, to help these victims. So that is the long game. But from a short perspective, they're concerned about the exposure of their name that's out there. Well, can we do something about anonymizing the data? Like, there's ISACs that are out there that are wealths of information for a lot of these companies that are out there. Well,
make it where you're incentivizing companies to be a part of those particular organizations, but make it so it's anonymized, right? I don't know how we can start to do that, because I know, at least from a lot of the companies that I've spoken to lately, they're concerned about even putting their name on that IC3 form, because I know that IC3 form is shared with other agencies that are out there as well. So then where, what are we going to benefit from it from a company perspective?
Jason, were you, I had an eye on you.
Gonna say. From a reporting perspective, there's kind of two different policy goals, at least in my mind, right? You think about like SEC reporting. It's difficult to imagine that the assumption is that the SEC is going to be the ones to take that information to be in the position to, take some type of action that will kind of address some of the concerns around it. So really that reporting angle is more of a little bit of a cudgel over the industry to say, hey, listen, we need you guys to come forward. This is for investor protection. This is for like a lot of different policy reasons. I think the other types of reporting, like the important public policy discussion is that needs to be part of a dynamic information sharing environment, right? It's not just for the purpose, because yes, you're right. I make a report and look, down the road, there's a lockbit takedown that is, and this is great. But I think what probably most victims want, and frankly, like from our own corporate perspective, what we would want is a much more dynamic communication channel with the government over, hey, what information can we share based on what you're seeing? What's the insurer seeing? So that everybody's kind of bringing to bear. I forget who said this earlier, but the nature of this issue is that it attacks the private sector. And so necessarily the public policy response has to be one that's integrated with the with the private sector. And that reporting function just can't be one way, I think, is really the challenge.
Jamie, did you want to hit on this? And then I have something I want to tilt us. So
I do think that the sort of argument for reporting, as we've alluded to, has got much stronger with some of the law enforcement operations that have generated decryption keys, because historically, I mean, the main argument for reporting is like out of altruism, to be honest, because it is a black hole offer and you're not going to get a lot back in return. But I think if you can sell the message now that not to overpromise anything, but that there may be ongoing law enforcement operations that are generating decryption keys, like the ones with Hive and Lockbit, that becomes a much more powerful, kind of, not selfish is the wrong word, but there's something tangible that might come out of it.
thank you, Jamie. So I want to tilt and maybe put the cyber insurance market under the microscope a little bit more. In our 24 out of 24 recommendations, a number of them speak to accelerating the development of a cyber insurance market that is enhancing the community. It's helping drive security standards upward. Just a few things that I think pick up on the response and recovery fund conversation that we had earlier this afternoon. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners recently estimated that the cyber insurance market has spent $4 billion in claims last year. So, thinking about the $20 million that's been earmarked, and that marketplace, that $4 billion is going to a policyholder base that we think is less than 10% of most companies of all companies in the United States. So the market penetration isn't there for us to necessarily drive standards beyond our borders. And then there's been the rise of sort of, the first fire departments were founded by insurance companies, and in the absence of there being a cyber rescue service, a number of insurance companies have started to invest in services, incident response services, proactive advisory services. And so just thinking about this nascent marketplace and its continued development, I want to ask the group, and people can jump in as they will. What's your view on the perspective of whether the insurance market is encouraging payment, whether we're creating moral hazard by even sustaining and absorbing those billions of dollars of losses every year, and what are we doing about the ransomware problem? Who wants to take that on first?
Like AXA is a global company. We identified 3 key risks for the globe: climate change, political unrest, and cyber. And the mission of the company is to help people to help that risk, to help bear that burden on that risk. And it's a global effort. And I think the insurance company, what they see with cyber is not just putting money out there, but putting a service out there. So when you buy a policy, it's not just that we're giving you a limit. It's not just that we're throwing out money at the door. It's providing services before, during, and after an event. I also manage our vendor services and cyber services for XXL for North America, and there's a huge push to have resources available to our insureds to better prepare for an incident. Do you have a business continuity plan? It's great that you have an IR plan, but how are you going to keep afloat? You do it for a flood, you do it for a hurricane. This is just as bad. It's a catastrophic event and you need to be prepared. And so a lot of insurance companies are taking on the responsibility of helping people better prepare. And through an incident, providing services, the better they recover from an event, the better everybody is off. Every employee in that company, everybody that relies on the services of that company, the insurance company, the families of those folks, everybody's better off if it's a good investigation and response. And then on the backside, the lessons learned. What was the root cause? Some of the things that we're seeing now are these insanely sophisticated events. And, we're talking to our underwriters and we're saying, hey, listen, this SIM swapping is an issue. What are we asking our insureds about? What are the controls that we are putting into place to better protect against social engineering? What are we doing to better protect against the severity of an incident? If somebody's going to get in, chances are they'll likely get in. And if they do get in, how bad is it going to be? Are there questions that we can ask and controls that we can put in place? And I know, Michael, you and I have talked about it where I've said, listen, there was a hard market a couple of years ago where the controls were high, the rates were high. But I think that led to a lot of resilience in companies because the controls were there. They were really working to say, listen, we've done our research. We've done the work ahead of an event to tell you, if you don't have this, it's going to be an issue. And Carolyn and I were laughing because we heard a rumor that a really big event that just happened, the root cause was stolen credentials for a remote access application that wasn't sitting behind MFA. And blows my mind. And that's an essential control that you would see on an insurance policy to even get it. But I will say that in addition to the penetration not being that much, most insureds are, I think the study was 350% underinsured. So the event, they only have insurance to cover a very small fraction of what the actual costs are.
Jamie?
So I just want to start by saying that it's not the purpose of an insurance market or the cyber insurance market to solve security or societal cyber resilience. If it does, it's kind of a byproduct, and its main purpose is to transfer risk. Are they part of the problem or part of the solution? I think if we look back 7 or 8 years, I would argue that the market was a bit too laissez-faire around ransom payments, around underwriting. Limits were too high. I personally would question if we'd seen ransom demands and payments hit the levels that they did without kind of limits that were, to be frank, too high, and threat actors were quite good at responding to those. I do think that, the losses that the cyber insurance market experienced, they were good at reacting to that. Tightened a lot of the underwriting, the security controls, co-insurance and sub-limits on ransomware coverage, which I think probably did help pull ransom payments down again. So I think it's reached a point now where we can say with a bit more confidence that it's part of the solution. I think though, if we are going to rely on a market, and it touches on what you just said, it's great when it was a hard market, but if it's a soft market again, are we just going to go back to the way that it was? And I guess that's a question for my insurance panelists.
Just on the moral hazard question, because that's one that I know I get a lot. And it's understandable why someone would ask that question. I would offer two, just a quantitative data point and then maybe a qualitative data point, just to talk through what that might mean in practice. The reality is that ransoms are a fraction of the types of payments that insurance companies make. And ransomware is just one type of crime, right? But there's Net Diligence puts out a data set. I think it's over 5 years. There are more than 10,000 claims that they looked at. And there they sort of broke out what the payments are for. And nearly half or slightly over half went to business disruption, right? And then the next highest amount, which is somewhere close to, the numbers don't exactly match up because it's also close to half, would be for things like digital forensic services and incident recovery services, breach coaches. And then below that would be things like, hardware, ransoms, but those are really a minority. And the reason that is the way that it is because many insurers today, as we continue to evolve, are actually doing everything that we can to avoid payments, right? Because we recognize that any money that goes into this ecosystem is actually just going to come back and get us later. That's the reality. The second data point that I would offer is when a breached entity has an insurance company, Catherine Lyle was famous for saying, we are 911. They know who to call right away, and then the insurer will immediately get them set up with lawyers, incident response firms, et cetera. It's that ecosystem that I think also is helping insurers make better decisions when it comes to payments and hopefully eventually resilience. And that data that's borne out in the data. I know Covoir's in the room, but there are a lot of different stats for this, but we've seen the likelihood for entities to pay decline over time. I think the last Covoir stat that I saw was about 31% of those that I don't know if it's reasonable and necessary, but of those that they see that come to them are actually paying. And we have similar stats. And I think so that's the qualitative point. And I think it's precisely because back to the 24 and 24, we're asking the kinds of questions that actually policymakers are trying to drive, right? Like, what are your alternatives to payment? Have you thought about them? And connecting you with a digital forensics and incident response firm. We heard Sandra from Mandiant talk about, we understand if this particular threat actor actually is trustworthy. I hate to use that word, but like is actually, if you're gonna, if you get a decryptor key, like is that a 4 or 5 day recovery? And we'll see that CEOs will come to the table not really understanding. They think they get a decryptor key and they're going to in 2 hours be back online. Their backups get them online in 2 days. It can be the incident response firm that brings a thoughtful, dispassionate approach and says, actually, we know this actor, the decryptor key is a 6-day affair. So this environment and ecosystem, I think it would be misleading to say that insurers are encouraging ransomware payments.
So Carolyn, I want you to pick this up, but if I could frame your remarks, you advise both insured companies and uninsured companies. Do you find that insured companies behave differently at that point of crisis, like for like, against uninsured companies?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I feel like uninsured companies, what they do, unfortunately, is that they've called their buddy down the street who may or may not know what to do. And a lot of the times I get them where it's, they've wiped all the evidence clean and they don't know what was taken, what was not. They don't know who to pay, who to not. And, look, and it's the well-intentioned person who they call down the street, but that might be the same person who they're utilizing day in and day out to do, their printers back up and running, right? And it's not saying that some of those people don't know what they're doing, because that's not necessarily the case, but a lot of the times they'll use somebody who doesn't know this day in and day out. To Suzanne's point, to your point, I know you and I have talked about this a lot, to Gwenn's point, and to your point as well, which is, hey, look, there's reasons why you have the panel of people that you do. There's reasons of the people that you call day in and day out. I always say to everybody, encourage people, brokers, the brokers who are worth their salt will be the first ones to say this. Reasons why you have insurance, while you pay for it. But one of the first things that you do is that from a proactive standpoint, you use those meet the breach coach calls. We'll talk to you, by the way, at no cost to you, at, hey, look, let's talk through, let's look behind the Wizard of Oz, curtain and say, these are the people that you need. This is what to anticipate. These are the contracts that you need to review them now. So you're not reviewing them in the heat of the moment. These are the kinds of things that you need to think about from a payment perspective. All those questionnaire considerations. Why would you need to be thinking about this? Why the to pay or not to pay discussion? Have that now in advance, instead of when everybody's in a panic, we need to get back up and running. To Suzanne's point about everybody thinks that you're going to get this decryptor tool and everything's going to come back in a pretty little bow. It doesn't. You have data corruption issues 99% of the time. I mean, I know there's Mandy in the room, Arete was in the room earlier. They're going to say the same thing to you. Some of these decryptor tools will be the first ones to say, hey, look, it doesn't work out the way that you want it to. And you need to think about it from a business perspective of being down. But I think, just to go back to the point about whether or not the insurance industry is really helping with this scenario, the answer is yes, because they're making this to be a bigger part of a larger discussion. There's market penetration issues. Well, let's make this be a bigger part of where we need to be from a company perspective. Get the resources that you need and utilize them.
All right, so we've got just a few minutes, and I'd like to make sure that we get an opportunity to get audience questions. And please grill Jason on
yes.
the cryptocurrency.
I would like
space.
to.
He's got off so easy all day,
Yeah.
and we're reaching the end of our chat today. So, any audience questions? Oh, don't be so shy. Yes, sir.
I have heard that you have access to a huge amount of cases, unfortunately, in one side. Fortunately, on the other, you have a huge visibility as well on what is going on at let's say, in the ransomware world, probably as better or even better than law enforcement. So my question is, since you are fully committed on helping to get rid of this type of threat, what are the actions that your companies are taking with regards to cooperation with law enforcement in order to tackle this threat?
Sure.
You guys want to? I could go. Go ahead.
No, I mean, not from a cooperation standpoint from us. Obviously, the government is a large customer of ours, but I think it's interesting to watch the evolution of like a blockchain analysis solution and how the government is leveraging that. I think where we've had a lot of success as a company is that most investigators know when there is a cryptocurrency issue that there's tools that can be leveraged to like help track the funds and stuff. The conversation I think we're having now with a lot of our government partners is kind of how do we take this to the next step, right? Which isn't just a matter of like, let's identify one flow of funds and see if we can follow the trail as to where it ends up. But it's doing things like fingerprinting what certain actors do with their funds, right? Like, is there a certain way that they always launder funds such that you can kind of predict where it might go? Are there places where we can identify where funds are getting pooled together, where there might be a disruption element that is more effective than standing in at the level where it's just a direct payment from a victim to the criminal's wallet? And so I think there's like a sophistication gap, right? Our tools are pretty powerful in my mind, but they're new, right? The idea of like, how do you take all this publicly available information to kind of ingest it and come up with some solution as to how do you address where these criminals are at is a long process that requires sophistication, requires resources, requires a lot of communication back and forth between like our companies, at least in the government. And then, that doesn't even take into account like gleaning all the information that we don't have that the folks who are dealing directly with the victims do have.
So why don't we, lightning round this, and then we can break for our final pieces. So Gwen,
I was going to say, I always say, like, when we're talking about data, know who you're talking to, because the perspective is very different based on the work that they do. So you might be working with a company that mainly does small market, small business, mid-market, and their experience is going to be very different from large enterprise. And so I think it's valuable to get data from multiple sources, both public and private. I think that we could do a better job of sharing information. From our perspective, it has to be confidential. It has to be anonymized. We have a duty to our clients and our insureds to make sure that they're make sure that they're protected, that their confidentiality is protected. But I do think that we can do a much better job on sharing information and working better with the public-private. I know that we do a lot of private in our industry because we all work together. It's fun, it's great, but I think that the public-private could be done a little bit better.
Jamie, anything you want to challenge the industry to do?
No, not at the moment. I think that we are seeing a kind of I mean, it's interesting if you look at the kind of history of the kidnap for ransom insurance market. I think if you look at the sort of evolution of the kidnap for ransom insurance market, you do see this kind of informal market governance of kidnap for ransomware response, which creates kind of stabilization around ransom payments. It creates better security for insureds. And I do think over time, we're seeing a similar dynamic with cyber insurance as well.
I mean, I think it's all about developing a trust relationship because I think now, you know, I've had really great relationships with people within FBI, with CISA, with, I mean, Homeland Security, everybody now who, if I give this information to you, what can, you know, obviously that what, because a lot of our clients want to know what can we do to help you back. Like I will tell you right now, we've had so much wire transfer fraud. I know this goes beyond ransomware, but wire transfer fraud is a very big problem right now. I know who to call and pick up the phone 24 hours a day, right? So I think it does work both ways. And I think that's going to become a bigger part of the discussion as we go forward. But I think now it's instead of it just being a one-way conversation, I've seen it more, especially within the past year, within all the agencies, have been very much a communication back and forth.
Yeah, just quickly, I would say that there is some information sharing happening. I would draw a distinction. I mean, it's consistent with what everyone has said. We protect our insureds first, so we don't necessarily offer details about specific breaches, but we run honeypots as other insurance firms do as well. So we flag trends. If we see a particular sector being hit more than others, these are things that we communicate. And that kind of general information, as Director Easterly mentioned earlier, is the kind of thing that sometimes informs some of the advisories.
Okay, super fast. Threat hunting, early warning systems with NCSC. We're hoping to expand that in the US and internationally. So look forward to chat later. And I would like it if everyone would thank this wonderful panel for sharing their expertise.